The street felt like any quiet suburban road at the tail end of a peaceful afternoon. The sky held the last hints of warm golden light, and every now and then a gentle breeze shuffled through the leaves. In the driveways of neat little houses, a few cars were parked while others rumbled off into the dusk, their owners returning from long days of work. It was the kind of neighborhood where one might expect to find children riding bicycles up and down the sidewalk, a teenager mowing the lawn with music blasting through headphones, or an older couple leisurely gardening together in the cooler evening air. Yet on this particular night, something was different, as if the usual hush carried an undertone that set everyone on edge. Windows were shutting fast, curtains were drawn, and the typical nightly routines halted as though some unspoken alarm had been sounded behind closed doors. You could practically feel front doors latch with an eerie finality, each click reverberating across the street. Amid this sudden shift from welcoming suburbia to tense stillness stood Dwayne Johnson, a man whose athletic figure and steady gait spoke of a once inexhaustible energy, now tempered by experience. Age had graced him with subtle lines near the corners of his eyes, hints of silver peppered through his short-cropped hair, and an unshakable calm. He walked slowly, hands in the pockets of his worn brown jacket, as if he had all the time in the world. And in a sense, he did. For Dwayne, life had always been about taking things on his own terms, seeing what needed to be done and stepping forward, no matter the risk. This particular street was unfamiliar territory to him. Only hours earlier, he'd been wandering the broader city limits, letting fate decide his next location. Over the years, Dwayne had drifted through various towns, never staying long enough to put down real roots. He was more like a traveling guardian, inadvertently finding trouble or stumbling on it. Whether that trouble was in the form of punks causing chaos or deeper, more systemic problems, Dwayne always seemed to land in the midst of people who either desperately needed help or just didn't know they needed it yet. On this night, though, the hush was more abrupt than usual. It caught his attention, pricking at old instincts honed from countless confrontations. He paused at the corner of the street under the glow of a flickering lamp, watching as people hurried indoors, some sneaking anxious glances over their shoulders. Even pets seemed agitated. A dog barked and yipped at something unseen before its owner tugged it inside. The occasional flash of movement through a window suggested that watchers remained vigilant. It wasn't fear of random crime. It felt more targeted, as though a known threat was making its presence felt. Dwayne's eyes swept across the rows of houses, the manicured lawns, and the flower beds meticulously maintained by proud homeowners. Yet tonight, no one was tending their gardens, no one was chatting over the fences. Instead, there was only him, standing alone in the open like a sentinel who hadn't gotten the memo to take cover. He tugged his jacket closer against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the faint scent of night-blooming flowers and the dying warmth of the day. Whatever had spooked these neighbors was serious, and he felt it in the crisp air. Part of him was ready to keep walking. He owed these people nothing, after all. Yet just as he was about to continue on, something made him stop. A sound at first, the squeak of wheels. Then the sight of a young girl in a wheelchair pushing herself up the sidewalk with measured, deliberate turns of her rims. Her slim shoulders were set with quiet determination. Dwayne's first thought was that someone so young shouldn't be roaming the street alone while everyone else cowered behind their drapes. His second thought was simpler. Maybe she didn't scare easily. He had, after all, noticed that trace of boldness in her posture even at a distance. She was approaching steadily, her eyes darting from house to house, seeming more concerned about what lurked in the shadows than about him. When she was close enough for him to see the slight furrow of her brow, Dwayne gave a small wave and stepped toward her, all the while keeping his expression calm and disarming. "Hey there," he said, voice low so as not to startle her. "You doing all right?" The girl, Zara as he would soon learn, halted a few paces away. Her hair was pulled back in two neat braids, and she wore a simple sweatshirt against the chill. A subtle wariness creased her features, a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Dwayne had seen that look before, mostly on adults who'd learned the hard way not to trust strangers. Coming from someone so young, it was both heartbreaking and impressive. "I'm okay," Zara replied, glancing behind her. The flicker of her gaze told him she was expecting trouble, or maybe just making sure it wasn't following her from another direction. But you shouldn't be out here. Dwayne raised an eyebrow. Why's that? She hesitated, then shrugged. It's not safe. You didn't notice how everyone went inside? I did, he admitted, and I was about to follow suit. But I saw you, and I figured maybe I should say hi. Make sure you weren't having any trouble. It was Zara's turn to raise an eyebrow. She studied him, perhaps noticing the faint scar at his temple or the purposeful way he stood, balanced on the balls of his feet. You're new here, she stated rather than asked. You don't know what's been going on. Dwayne offered a lopsided grin. Guess not. Want to fill me in? She stayed silent for several heartbeats, her knuckles tightening on the wheelchair's rims. Then she motioned her head toward the far end of the block. Dwayne followed her gaze to a dimly lit area beneath a broken street lamp. Three shapes huddled there, faintly outlined by the glow of a lamp halfway down the road. He couldn't make out faces, but from their stance, hands in pockets, shoulders hunched, it looked like they were waiting. Stalking even. Those men, Zara murmured, they've been coming around for months, telling people they don't belong here, that this is their neighborhood. Her voice caught, and Dwayne's mind filled in the blanks. Intimidation, harassment, maybe worse. He felt his teeth clamp down, anger rising in his chest. The old reflex, the unstoppable push inside him that always demanded to stand up to bullies. You saying they target certain folks? He asked softly, though he already suspected the answer. Zara looked him in the eye, and he could see a flicker of sadness and defiance swirling there. They picked on me right away, she explained. Probably thought I couldn't fight back. They call me slurs, push me around when nobody's watching, and they scare everyone else so much that people lock their doors rather than stand up to them. She shrugged, a strange acceptance in her posture. I got used to it, but tonight feels different. Dwayne's gaze stayed on the figures in the distance, adrenaline sparking in his veins. He recognized that vibe. Men who wanted control, who took advantage of fear to gather power. Bullies who thrived on silence and intimidation. He'd encountered them in small towns, big cities, and once even in a half-abandoned rest stop near a highway. They existed everywhere, wearing different faces, but the same twisted sneer. Different how? He asked, gently nudging Zara for more details. She sighed. They usually shout at people and then move on. Tonight, they came with something else in mind. I can just feel it. They looked angrier. She dropped her eyes, her hands curling around the rims of her wheelchair. Dwayne nodded, heart pounding with simmering agitation. He wasn't one to go seeking out conflict, but if it landed on his doorstep, or in this case on a street where a child was in danger, he couldn't walk away in good conscience. Still, he knew there was no point in urging Zara to handle things alone. She was just a kid, and these men seemed the type who'd escalate if they met the slightest resistance from someone vulnerable. A single lamp flickered overhead, casting dance-like shadows across their faces. Listen, Dwayne said, his voice low. Why don't you head on home? I'll see if I can have a little chat with them. Maybe convince them to find somewhere else to skulk around tonight. Zara's lips parted in surprise. Then a flicker of a grin touched her features, disappearing just as fast. You don't know them. They'll want to prove a point. Dwayne bent slightly at the waist, keeping his tone gentle. Kid, I've been around. Men like them thrive on fear. Take that away. They have less power. Don't worry about me. She studied him, head cocked to one side as though deciding whether to trust his confidence. Eventually, she gave a small nod. Fine, but if you're going to talk, do it fast. They don't talk for long. He watched as she wheeled herself back a few yards, perhaps aiming to keep a safe distance without fully retreating. One glance over his shoulder reassured him she was still in sight, though overshadowed by the ramp leading up to her front porch. Her house seemed modest, with a wheelchair ramp that had probably been installed when she was much younger. The light in the window was switched off, no sign of movement behind the curtains. But that didn't mean no one was watching. People everywhere in this neighborhood were surely peeking through blinds, hoping to see what might unfold without having to intervene. There was something heartbreakingly familiar about that. Good people cowering while a few bullies strutted around. He'd witnessed it time and again. In a dusty southwestern town, in an urban neighborhood stricken by economic despair, fear always paralyzed communities in the same universal way. Dwayne didn't blame them exactly. He knew what fear did to folks. It sapped courage, snuffed out hope. But part of him ached with frustration that, once again, it would be up to a single person, him or some other solitary figure, to make a stand. He inhaled deeply, then made his way down the sidewalk, approaching the trio with steady, unhurried steps. As he got closer, he could see them more clearly. The first was a lanky man with a shaved head and a half-burnt cigarette perched on his lips. The second, thick-necked and covered in tattoos, cracked his knuckles loudly, exhaling a menacing chuckle. The third, standing a bit behind, had his hands in his pockets, scanning the area with eyes that flicked restlessly from side to side. They were in their mid-30s by Dwayne's guess, with the postures of men who believed they owned any space they occupied. They noticed him the instant he moved out of the lamplight's glare. Cigarette Man tilted his head, flicking ash to the ground. Tat, who wore a sleeveless hoodie and had swirling ink all up his arms, shifted his weight as though preparing to lunge. Pocket Hands looked momentarily surprised, but then recovered, sneering. "Evening," Dwayne greeted, his tone civil, but not at all submissive. The one with the cigarette narrowed his eyes. "You got a death wish, buddy? This ain't your business." Dwayne shrugged, hands still in the pockets of his jacket. "Seemed like nobody else was stepping up, so might as well be me." A slow grin spread across Tat's face. "You for real?" he said in a mocking drawl. "You see folks running off, right? They know better." "What I see," Dwayne said calmly, glancing up and down the quiet stretch of road, "is a nice neighborhood where kids can't even play on their lawns without being harassed. Seems to me, that's not knowing better. That's being scared." Cigarette Man snorted, dribbling a thin stream of smoke out the side of his mouth. "Maybe they got good reason to be." "Maybe," Dwayne allowed. "But then again, maybe the reason is standing right in front of me, flicking ashes all over a street that doesn't belong to him." Something about Dwayne's casual stance and even tone seemed to irritate them, more than if he'd been full of bravado. Cigarette Man glared, spitting out the spent butt onto the sidewalk and crushing it under his boot. "You better walk away, old man. Next few minutes are going to get ugly if you don't." Dwayne noted how they kept glancing toward the house where Zara had retreated. In Bully's eyes, a wheelchair might as well be a flashing target. He felt a pulse of anger at the idea of them picking on a child whose only crime was existing in what they considered their territory. There was also something else in their expressions. Resentment, maybe. Resentment that some outsider dared to intervene, upending their carefully built kingdom of fear. He pivoted the toes of one foot, ensuring his stance was balanced. "You want to try me?" His voice was measured, not arrogant, "because if you think I'm running, you're dead wrong." Tat took a single step forward, rolling his neck as though loosening up for a fight. "Boy, you're either insane or you got a real thick skull." Pocket Hands withdrew one hand from his jacket, revealing a small canister. Pepper spray, by the look of it. Low-level intimidation, typical of men who like to terrorize folks who never fought back. He lifted it threateningly, finger hovering near the trigger. "Yeah, how about you back off right now, or you're going to find out why it's a bad idea to mouth off to us." There was no dramatic moment of pause for reflection. Dwayne acted on instinct. He sprang forward, hooking the man's wrist before the finger could depress the nozzle. A hiss of chemical spray sputtered across empty air, stinging the night with a tangy chemical reek. Shoving the man's arm aside, Dwayne twisted it behind the man's back, forcing him onto his knees with a painful grunt. Then, with a careful precision that spoke of long-ago training, Dwayne yanked the pepper spray out of his grasp and flung it away, sending it clattering into the gutter. Tat barreled into the fray, swinging a meaty fist at Dwayne's ribs. Dwayne pivoted, letting the blow glance off his side rather than land with full force. He elbowed Tat in the solar plexus, forcing a strangled whoosh of air from the bigger man's lungs. Cigarette Man came next, hand dipping into a pocket for what could easily be a knife. Without waiting to see the weapon fully, Dwayne delivered a short, sharp heel kick to the man's thigh, destabilizing him. A blade did flash briefly in Cigarette Man's grip, glinting under the sparse lamplight. But Dwayne was already following through, hooking the man's wrist, slamming it against the closest lamppost with a controlled force that loosened the fingers. The metal knife clattered on the pavement. A quick strike from Dwayne's knee introduced itself to Cigarette Man's midsection, and the would-be attacker staggered, breath hissing through gritted teeth as he folded onto the asphalt. By then, Tat had recovered enough to launch another assault, barreling toward Dwayne like a bull. Using Tat's own momentum against him, Dwayne shifted his weight and slammed his shoulder into Tat's side, causing the bigger man to lose balance and crash onto the hood of a parked car with an unpleasant metallic thud. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's window squeaked as it slid open, someone presumably peering out, summoning the courage to watch. Maybe they were finally ready to see who was actually standing up to these bullies. Pocket Hands, now freed, scrambled after the pepper spray, but as he groped for it, Dwayne grabbed him by the collar, yanking him upright. The man's arms flailed, and Dwayne slammed a forearm across his chest, pressing him against the lamppost. "Enough," he growled, his tone low and final. Pocket Hands coughed, eyes bulging as he struggled to inhale. A faint whimper escaped him. Tat moaned from the hood of the car, and Cigarette Man was hunched over, spitting curses at the ground. Dwayne eased off slightly, letting Pocket Hands breathe. "Let me guess," Dwayne said calmly, eyes scanning the man's face for any flicker of regret. "You thought you'd come around here again, terrorize a girl in a wheelchair, and call it a night?" The man's expression flickered between defiance and what could only be described as reluctant fear. He began, voice hoarse, but Dwayne didn't let him finish. "Save it," he snapped, stepping back. "Far as I'm concerned, you've lost whatever right you had to speak, short of apologizing to every single person on this block." Pocket Hands staggered, nearly losing his balance. Tat pressed a hand to his bruised ribs, muttering something under his breath. Cigarette Man finally stood, knife abandoned, eyes blazing with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat, wiping a dribble of blood from the corner of his mouth. Dwayne's gaze hardened. "Yeah, it is. Because if you come back here, if you make these people's lives a living hell again, you'll deal with me." He took one slow step closer, watching them all carefully. "And I can promise you'll regret it." For a moment, no one moved. Then Tat, still hunched in pain, lurched away from the car and started limping down the street. Pocket Hands and the Cigarette Man exchanged glances, but, seeing no better option, followed. The trio retreated, tossing Dwayne venomous looks over their shoulders. Before they disappeared around the corner, Cigarette Man shouted one last threat. "We know your face now. You think you can hide? You won't always be here." Dwayne let out a slow breath, shoulders still taut with lingering adrenaline. He picked up the discarded knife, pocketing it so they couldn't retrieve it later. Then he glanced in the direction of Zara's house. She was there. He could see her silhouette under the porch light, watching with an intensity that belied her age. A warmth moved through him, equal parts relief and concern. This was only one confrontation. Those men, or men like them, could easily return, and they might bring reinforcements next time. Bullies hated losing face. They hated being defied even more. He walked slowly toward Zara, adjusting the collar of his jacket where it had twisted during the scuffle. The hush that fell over the neighborhood was broken only by a few uncertain footsteps as neighbors peeked out. Some stood on porches with arms crossed, as though trying to decide whether to cheer or admonish him for stirring up more trouble. Zara offered him a small nod when he drew close. Her eyes flicked to the bruise forming on his knuckles. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice soft but unwavering. "Just fine," Dwayne replied, rotating his shoulder to ensure nothing was dislocated. "Could use some ice, maybe." She managed a hint of a smile, more a twitch of her lips than anything else. "They won't forget what you did. They'll come back," Dwayne sighed, looking past her at the shut windows of neighboring houses. "Yeah, they might. The question is, will anyone do something about it next time, or will they let them run wild again?" Zara lifted a shoulder in a weary gesture. "They've been dealing with it for a while. Most of them act like if you don't see it, it's not happening. But it's different now. She hesitated, a slight tremor in her voice. Because of you. He inclined his head, acknowledging her words while not fully accepting them. Look, kid, it's not about me. I'm just a stranger passing through. Zara gave him a look that was too mature for a girl her age, knowing, a bit sad. You said that like you've done it before, like you always do it. He opened his mouth and closed it. She wasn't wrong. In some measure, life had been a series of run-ins with situations that demanded a stand. It started in his early teens, when he defended his neighbor's son from older bullies behind the local high school. He hadn't been able to walk away then, and that trait never left him. Over the years, he'd found himself intervening in bar fights, stepping between a thief and his target in a dimly lit alley, or pulling someone back from a disastrous decision they would regret the rest of their life. It wasn't that he chased trouble. Trouble just happened to show up where he roamed. And once it arrived, his conscience never let him sit idle. He had lost jobs, friendships, even entire years on the road because he couldn't abide bullies or oppression in any form. I guess you could say that, he finally acknowledged, shifting on his feet. But that doesn't mean I have a blueprint for how to handle what happens next. That's up to you, your neighbors. He gestured vaguely at the street. All of you. A voice startled them both. You handled them, man. You got rid of those punks. Dwayne turned to see a fellow in his 40s, wearing a plaid shirt and well-worn jeans. This was Ethan, though Dwayne only learned that name after the man worked up the nerve to introduce himself. At the moment, Ethan hovered near the edge of his porch, apparently debating between the comfort of being indoors and the risk of stepping into the open. Dwayne nodded in quiet acknowledgement. For tonight doesn't mean they won't come back. Ethan grimaced, glancing down the street where the gang had fled. I know, but what you did, he shook his head in amazement. It's more than any of us did. That last statement landed heavily. Dwayne could almost feel the weight of guilt behind Ethan's words. This entire block had been terrorized by men who realized that if they just showed up regularly and displayed enough aggression, the neighborhood would fold. People had families to protect, mortgages to pay, no desire to risk bodily harm. Fear was a powerful deterrent. A few more folks, curious or emboldened, drifted into view. One was an older woman in a button-down cardigan, Marcy, it turned out, holding a timid golden retriever by the collar. Another was a short, wiry man with a baseball cap pulled low who introduced himself as Joel. They all seemed to ask the same question without saying it directly. What now? For a moment, no one spoke, the hush returning to fill the air like a smothering blanket. Dwayne wondered whether they'd hold on to their relief for a moment, or if the dread of future retaliation would snuff it out. Finally, Zara rolled her chair forward a few feet, positioning herself beside Dwayne like a silent co-conspirator. She looked around at the onlookers. You see? He showed them what happens when you fight back. Her tone was direct, lacking the usual timidness children sometimes showed around authority figures. But he can't stay here forever. It was striking how Zara was taking the role of a messenger. She wasn't scolding them exactly, just pointing out the elephant in the room. If Dwayne left, who would stand up to the gang next time? Marcy cleared her throat, her hold on the golden retriever loosening a bit. The dog, tail wagging uncertainly, looked ready to approach Dwayne but held back, as if sensing the tension. These men, they've been coming around for months, Marcy explained, voice tremulous. At first it was little things, a few nasty comments, looking at us like we didn't belong. Then it got worse. Threats, harassment. She gestured vaguely down the street. They told us if we called the police, we'd regret it. Some of us did call anyway, but she trailed off and Joel stepped in, rubbing his chin beneath the cap. The cops would drive by hours later, maybe shine a spotlight around, but the men were already gone, and it just made them angrier next time. He sighed. We've got families, children. We didn't want to risk it escalating. Dwayne could practically feel Ethan's shame and the tension roiling within the small group. Look, he said quietly, I'm not here to judge. Fear gets to everyone. But at some point, if you don't stand up, you let them control your entire life. Ethan exhaled heavily, his eyes flickering to Zara. She's been the bravest of any of us. She never shies away from them. I've seen her stand up for herself a dozen times, even when they tried pushing her wheelchair or cursing at her. Zara glanced down, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. They don't scare me, she muttered, as though disclaiming a badge she never asked to wear. Dwayne gave her a respectful nod. They shouldn't. People like that feed on fear, but you've denied them every chance at it. Marcy frowned, looking genuinely torn. So what do we do? Go out and confront them every time they show up? That's one approach, Dwayne replied. But realistically, you need a longer-term solution. Maybe real community watch. Maybe pressing the police to increase patrols at the right times. Maybe gathering evidence, photos, videos, so there's proof of what they do. It might not scare them off overnight, but if they know they're being watched by more than just one or two families, if they realize they can't act with impunity, it might make a difference. Joel snorted softly, not out of disrespect, but in that cynical manner people adopt when they've been disappointed too many times. And you think that'll work? Dwayne lifted a shoulder. Could, depends on whether you're all in or not. A silence followed, during which they all looked at one another as though searching for a consensus. Zara was the only one who didn't avert her gaze, pinning each adult with a level stare. Dwayne could guess what was running through her mind. Why should a kid have to live braver than grown men and women? Ethan cleared his throat. We can try to coordinate something. My brother's got a small security camera company. Maybe I can ask him about hooking us up with some cameras around the area. Marcy nodded, the dog leaning against her leg. My nephew's a lawyer in the next town. I could see if he has any suggestions about how to file a restraining order or some official complaint. Joel, still fiddling with the brim of his cap, let out a long sigh. We'll need to keep track of the times they show up. Gather as much info as possible so the cops can't say we're overreacting, because that's what they've been doing, claiming it's just teen trouble. It was something, a spark at least. Dwayne found himself marginally heartened by it. People who had cowered in their homes minutes earlier were now discussing strategy. Sure, they might not be well practiced in confrontation, but forming a plan was a start. Sounds like you've got ideas, Dwayne observed. Keep going with that. Don't let them scare you back into silence. Joel looked up, meeting Dwayne's gaze for the first time. What about you? Are you staying? It was a question Dwayne had fielded in various forms before. We need you here. We need your courage, your fists, your unshakable will. He'd learned long ago that if he hung around every place that needed help, he'd be stuck forever. The world was full of crises, big and small, and if he lingered too long, he risked making people dependent on an outsider's presence rather than discovering their own strength. I'm just passing through, he answered, not unkindly, but I can hang around a couple of days, see if I can keep them off your backs while you put those plans in motion. A ripple of relief broke across their tense faces. Though Ethan and Marcy both seemed to understand the finality in his tone, he wouldn't be here indefinitely. Zara's expression was unreadable, a guarded hope flickering behind her eyes. She cleared her throat. If you're staying a while, you can stay at my place. My mom, she's in the house. We have a spare room. I mean, if you want. That made Dwayne blink. The generosity was unexpected, especially from someone who'd just seen him tear into a group of troublemakers. He'd expected caution, maybe even condemnation, for stirring up a hornet's nest. But instead, there was only an earnest offer from a kid who was wise beyond her years. He scratched the back of his neck. I appreciate that. You should check with your mom first, though. Zara shrugged. She's super shy, but she told me to invite you. She's been watching from inside ever since things started. She watched everything you did out here. She knows you're the reason we can breathe easier tonight. Zara turned her chair, heading up the gentle slope of the ramp. Before she disappeared inside, she paused. You coming? Dwayne hesitated, but only for a moment, then followed her. Inside, the house was modest but cozy. The living room opened into a small hallway, leading to a kitchen at the back. A worn sofa and two mismatched chairs sat in front of a television. It reminded Dwayne of places he'd visited in simpler times, where families gathered for movie nights with bowls of microwave popcorn. The difference was the front curtains, carefully drawn, as though the inhabitants had grown used to checking outside for threats. Zara's mother, Serena, appeared around the corner. She was in her mid-30s, wearing a plain blouse with sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her expression caught between caution and gratitude. "Hi," she managed. "I'm guessing you're the one who helped Zara." Dwayne took off his jacket, folding it over one arm. "I did what I could." A moment of silence followed, during which Serena took in Dwayne's size, the bruise forming across his knuckles, and the faint scuff on his pant leg. She didn't flinch, but a flicker in her eyes betrayed worry. "I'm Serena," she said, voice subdued. I saw a bit of what happened out there. Those men have been terrorizing the block for ages now. Thank you." He inclined his head. "Dwayne." And really, it was nothing. Zara rolled over to the couch and parked beside it. "He doesn't stay in one place too long," she informed her mother, repeating his earlier words almost verbatim. "But he said he'd stay a few days. Is that okay?" Serena's expression softened. "Yes, of course. If you need a place to sleep, the guest room is yours. We don't have a lot, but there's dinner in the fridge if you're hungry. I can heat it up." Part of Dwayne wanted to refuse. Old habits of self-reliance tugged at him, but the warmth in Serena's voice and the night's exertions changed his mind. "That sounds great," he admitted. "Thank you." While Serena busied herself in the kitchen, Dwayne took a seat on the sofa. The cushions sank beneath his weight, and he realized he was more worn out than he'd first thought. Zara remained quiet, as though pondering a million questions she wasn't sure how to ask. Every now and then she cast him sidelong glances, and he wondered if she was examining the bruise on his hand or simply measuring him up as a person. Soft sounds of pots and pans clinking emerged from the kitchen. The overhead light in the living room was a bit dim, but it made the space feel intimate, secure. Dwayne found himself relaxing for the first time that evening. Despite the tension outside, there was a calm vibe here, thanks in large part to Serena's gentle movements and Zara's steady presence. Eventually, Zara broke the silence. "I've lived here my whole life. My mom, too. It was always nice, until those guys showed up and started acting like they ran the place." She fiddled with the wheels on her chair, turning them back and forth. "People just gave in. I never understood why." Dwayne laced his fingers together, exhaling softly. "Fear is a powerful thing. It's not that they want to give in, it's that they're worried about themselves and their families." A resigned look flickered across her features. "Does it ever stop?" He thought about it, remembering places he'd been, battles he'd fought that were physical and otherwise. "It can," he said slowly, "if enough people refuse to let fear control them." Later that night, when Serena showed him to the spare room, Dwayne quietly thanked her for the hospitality. The room was small but neat, with a narrow bed pressed against one wall and a small dresser in the corner. A single lamp cast a warm glow, revealing a few old pictures on the dresser. Zara at various stages of childhood, smiling bright despite the presence of the wheelchair. One photo showed her holding a trophy with a banner behind her that read Chess Club Regional Finals. Another was a family shot of Zara and Serena on a vacation, likely some years back, judging by Zara's smaller frame and missing front teeth. After Serena left, Dwayne settled onto the bed, untying his boots. The hush in the house was a world away from the tension in the streets. Outside, an occasional car passed, headlights drifting across the drawn curtains. He allowed his mind to wander, thinking about the men who had fled and how they might react to the setback. In his experience, punks like that didn't take well to being bested, especially not in front of each other. They fed on mutual bravado, and any bruised ego could push them to return with twice the aggression. He told himself he'd be ready if that happened, that he'd do what he could to protect Zara, Serena, and anyone else in the neighborhood who found themselves in the crosshairs. But an undercurrent of worry thrummed in his chest. He wasn't a kid anymore. His reflexes, though still sharp, weren't infinite. Could he handle a bigger group if they came back with weapons more serious than knives and pepper spray? He hoped it wouldn't escalate to that, but it wasn't his call alone. Though tired, sleep did not come easily. It rarely did when Dwayne was in a new place, and especially not after the adrenaline rush of a confrontation. Eventually, he drifted off into a light doze, the hum of a distant air conditioner providing white noise. He awoke in the earliest hours of the morning to a faint creak outside. Instinct snapped him alert, and he was on his feet, slipping into his boots. A quick glance at the small digital clock near the lamp told him it was just after 4 a.m. He eased the bedroom door open, gliding silently into the hallway. Stopping by Zara's room, he listened. Nothing but gentle breathing. Further down, a sliver of light glowed under Serena's door. Perhaps she was restless too. The front door was locked. He checked the windows, found them all secure. The faint sound he'd heard might have been the house settling or a passing cat. Whatever it was, the place seemed safe enough. Yet the tension in his shoulders refused to ease. These people had offered him shelter. The least he could do was keep an eye out. Standing by the window, he peered between the curtains into the front yard, scanning the street. A lone porch light across the road revealed nothing amiss. If any threat lurked out there, it was out of view for now. Unable to quell his alertness, Dwayne sank onto the couch, propping his feet on the coffee table. He flicked on a nearby lamp and eyed a stack of magazines. Riffling through them aimlessly, he found local advertisements, a few cooking periodicals, and a pamphlet about adaptive sports for kids with disabilities. He paused on that last one, recognizing Zara's unstoppable spirit. He wouldn't be surprised if she had tried wheelchair basketball or tennis or something else that tested her boundaries. She seemed like the type who saw limitations as a challenge to be confronted head-on, much like those bullies. The hour ticked by in relative silence. Eventually, Dwayne dozed off again, only to reawaken to the gentle sunlight of morning streaming through the edges of the curtains. He heard activity in the kitchen, pans clinking, water running. Pushing himself upright, he stretched his arms and glanced at the clock again. It was almost 7 a.m. When he walked into the kitchen, Serena was at the stove, preparing eggs and toast. Zara sat at the small table, absently spinning the salt shaker. Both looked up as he entered. "Morning," Serena greeted. "Did you sleep okay?" "Well enough," Dwayne replied, taking a seat across from Zara. "Thanks for letting me crash here," she offered a half smile. "Of course. I figured it was the least we could do after what you did last night." Zara studied him with a thoughtful expression, as though seeing him in the daylight provided new perspective. "They didn't come back," she stated, not so much a question as an observation. "Not yet," Dwayne concurred, "but that doesn't mean they won't. So what's your plan for today?" Serena set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. "I have a shift at the community center this afternoon. Zara usually stays with our neighbor Marcy if I'm running late, but I'm not sure how safe that is now." She glanced at Zara, concern evident in her eyes. "But I have to go in. We need the paycheck." Zara shrugged. "I'll be fine. I can fend for myself." Serena's lips pressed into a tight line, revealing how torn she was between necessity and worry. Dwayne glanced at Zara. He admired her spirit, but he also remembered how quickly things had escalated just a few hours before. "I can hang around," he offered casually, trying not to make it sound like a huge sacrifice. "I told your neighbors I'd stick around for a couple of days." A wave of relief passed through Serena's features. "That would help, if you're sure you don't mind." He shook his head. "No trouble. I'll find ways to keep busy." After breakfast, Zara rolled outside with Dwayne following, while Serena prepared for work. The morning sunlight gave the street a kinder appearance than it had the night before, though the memory of shadows remained. A few neighbors were out, as if testing the air. Ethan stood in his driveway, rummaging through the trunk of his car. Marcy walked her golden retriever on a leash, greeting them with a faint nod. Joel was nowhere to be seen, but Dwayne figured he might show up eventually. Zara's eyes flicked to the corner where the first confrontation had taken place. She seemed pensive. "You think they'll really come back?" Dwayne exhaled, scanning the road. "I think people like that don't let go of anger easily. They might try to find a time or place where they've got the advantage. But if this neighborhood stands united, it'll be a lot harder for them to pull that off." She fell silent, her gaze traveling along the facades of the pastel-painted houses. A few windows twitched with movement, more watchers perhaps. The entire block felt on edge, like it was holding its breath, waiting for a sign of either permanent safety or renewed terror. Ethan shut his trunk and meandered over. "Morning," he ventured. "Heard any news on those guys?" Dwayne shook his head. "Not yet." Ethan scratched his temple. "Well, I talked to my brother about some cameras. He said he could come by in the next few days. That should at least help deter them, or catch them on video." "That's good," Dwayne affirmed. "If they see cameras around, they'll know they can't act with impunity." A flicker of hope crossed Ethan's face. "Think so?" Dwayne folded his arms, his expression resolute. "Yeah, one thing bullies hate is exposure. They like to operate from a position of power, intimidation. Shine a light on them, and it's a different story."